The Indian External Affairs Minister will be proceeding to Tokyo just after his meeting with the Chinese Foreign Minister. India remains engaged with China. India has so far been a keen member of the QUAD, but has been a little shy of getting into a kind of a security-oriented arrangement within the QUAD. There is what you might call a developing trust deficit with the United States. I don't think the India-US relationship can be replaced by any other relationship. The Americans in particular have tried to influence and meddle in Indian elections. The Americans have just announced that they're going to give over $100 million to Pakistan. And hold your breath, they're going to give $100 million to Pakistan to promote democracy in Pakistan. The QUAD foreign ministers will once again be meeting towards the end of the month in Tokyo. And as is normal, the usual stuff will be discussed, which is basically about how the situation in the Indo-Pacific region is unfolding, what are the challenges, what are the things that the QUAD countries can do together to coordinate, how they propose to deal with the mounting challenge which all countries in the region as well as the QUAD countries face from a belligerent China. So this meeting will be important also for deciding whether or not there will be a summit meeting of the QUAD leaders later in this year. There's a bit of a question mark around it, partly because of President Joe Biden's health, the fact that he's now bowing out of the presidential race. So he is in some ways already a bit of a lame duck, and whether any policy initiative which he takes will be carried forward. Maybe if his successor is the vice president, it will be carried forward. But if it is Donald Trump, then he may have a rethink on the QUAD. Although while he was president, he kind of was okay with the QUAD countries getting together. So there are going to be these issues that will come on the table. Asides of this, I think from an Indian point of view, what is important is that the Indian External Affairs Minister would be proceeding to Tokyo just after his meeting with the Chinese Foreign Minister. And, you know, while India and China remain engaged, the militaries are talking to each other, the diplomats are talking to each other, and of course at the political level there have been a number of meetings between Wang Yi and Dr. Jaishankar. And while there seems to be some kind of stability, an uneasy stability which has come in India-China relations, there is no resolution towards which both sides are moving. It's the same boilerplate kind of statements which come out. The Indians say something, the Chinese say other things. In fact, if you look at the readouts which have been issued after the meeting between the Indian and the Chinese foreign ministers, it seems that while they might be talking about the same things, they're coming to it from different places, and maybe something is being lost in translation between the two sides on what are the kind of understandings, what is the kind of roadmap forward. But what is important is that India remains engaged with China. At the same time, after this meeting, Dr. Jaishankar will be meeting his counterparts from the other QUAD countries, and we'll have to see how what is the kind of positioning which India does. India has so far been a keen member of the QUAD, but has been a little shy of getting into a kind of a security-oriented arrangement within the QUAD, which is why something called the Squad has also come into being, or at least that's the name which is being given to it. It is the other three QUAD countries, namely the United States, Japan and Australia, and along with it Philippines and they have entered into a kind of a security arrangement where they're monitoring the seas, patrol boats, and all kinds of other things are starting to happen. There's been some speculation whether the Quad is now going to be replaced by the Squad, which I think is a bit of a stretch, because compared to the kind of pivotal position which India enjoys, I don't see how Philippines, which is a very important member if you are talking about Quad Plus, or Indonesia or some of the other Southeast Asian countries, will play a very critical role in any larger kind of a grouping to ensure that the Chinese are kept at bay. I don't see how individually any of these countries, or even collectively, can replace the salience of India in whatever new arrangements have to be made out. India has been a little chary, partly because of historical reasons, partly because India feels that throwing its lot in any one camp is not going to be ideal for Indian diplomacy, for Indian interests, and that we must keep what we very often refer to as strategic autonomy in place. One can point out certain holes in this entire argument, but there is also a lot to commend this argument. Now, there is a lot to commend this argument for a couple of reasons. For example, there is what you might call a developing trust deficit with the United States. India has historically had very close relations at a people-to-people level with the United States. The United States has been looked up to, but at the political level, at the governmental level, there have been deep suspicions about the Americans. Their tendency and their proclivity to interfere in countries, their tendency to moralize, to sermonize, to hector countries, their expectations that everybody must be a mirror image of America itself, is something which hasn't really gone down well with India, and partly because of colonial baggage, partly because India likes to jealously protect her autonomy. Indians have always been a bit withdrawn when it comes to getting into a very close embrace with the Americans, and yet we've seen over the last 2 decades or so a tectonic shift in India's perceptions about the United States, the fact that we have a kind of a security relationship, not an alliance or anything like that, but in the sense that we're buying security equipment, defense equipment, platforms from the United States. There are a massive range of areas in which there's technical collaboration, there's people to people, there's trade, you name it. I don't think the India-US relationship can be replaced by any other relationship. So there has been a tectonic shift in how India and the US deal with each other. And I'm not getting into that nonsense of shared values. That's a slogan. India and the United States had the same shared values of democracy and pluralism and what have you. When the Americans were embracing Pakistan, the dictators of Pakistan who had murdered democracy in Pakistan, they were the most allied ally of the Americans. And this is not too long back. Even Musharraf was, for that matter, which is in this century, and I'm not even going back into the 20th century. So the shared values business is a nice slogan. It's a good tagline to sell. But beyond that, it is national interests which matter for countries when they get into a close relationship with each other or a partnership. But I think what has started happening is that despite the massive change that has taken place over the last 20 years or so, over the last few months, maybe a couple of years, you could say, that once again there is that creeping distrust of the Americans coming into India. And this is something which is both ways. For example, the Americans have their own problems, and I'll come to it in a bit. But from the Indian point of view, we have seen a kind of a concerted campaign against India. in the American media, and anybody who tells you that the American media is entirely free on international affairs is giving you a cock and bull story. This is Godi media raised to the power of whatever you want to call it. For anybody to suggest that there has not been a concerted campaign against the incumbent government, I think that's not true. There has been the think tanks, the media. It's a singular line of criticism of a drain inspector's report, as can be called, of everything which is wrong with India and nothing which is right with India. And yet, at the official level, they'll talk about shared values and stuff like that. So there has been that factor which has left a bitter taste in the mouth of many Indians. There have been, of course, Indian leaders who have themselves sought interference from the West. But leave that aside, the fact remains that there are very deep suspicions that the West, the Americans in particular, have tried to influence and meddle in Indian elections. We see the American embassy in Delhi actually, and not only the American embassy, other embassies as well, Western embassies, actually patronize people who can be a bit of a problem as far as the Indian security establishment is concerned. And clearly, there are certain sensitivities that while in India, political dissidence is completely welcome, should be there. But when foreign embassies start flirting with some of these characters and trying to build them up as some kind of great warriors fighting against some operation or some kind of dictatorship in India, I think that's going a bit too far. And this is exactly the impression which one is getting. So there is that interference and meddling in Indian affairs. There is, of course, a big problem between India and the United States, and this actually runs counter to understandings within the QUAD. Is also a group of which has come out openly against terrorism in all its forms and manifestations, which has said that they will work together to crack down on international travel by terrorists or their supporters, or even crack down on terror finance and other activities of terrorism. But yet we see when it comes to this Khalistani movement, there seems to be a completely different approach. Not just in Canada, which is become a kind of a safe haven for Khalistani terrorists, and I think that's very clear. By you look at it. If you issue death threats against the Canadian Prime Minister, you can be booked. But if you are issuing death threats, and some of them very potent, against Indian diplomats, against Indian political leaders, then it's freedom of speech. This is Canada for you, which is a very close ally of the Americans. And the Americans themselves have kind of doubled down, at least surreptitiously, in their support for the Khalistanis. And there are very serious concerns which are developing in India on the kind of support that the Americans are giving to these guys. And then, of course, there are reliability issues. The Americans in the past used to say, when Afghanistan was still a very active theater, they would say that, while the US and India have 95% convergence east of India, there's only 5% convergence west of India. One would have thought that after America abandoned Afghanistan to the Taliban, there would be greater convergence between India and the United States, but clearly there isn't. And now we hear that once again the flirtation, that old love affair between the United States and Pakistan's military rulers seems to have started all over again, and including the fact that we are seeing that the Americans have just announced that they're going to give over $100 million to Pakistan. And hold your breath, they're going to give $100 million to Pakistan to promote democracy in Pakistan. This is when an entire election has been rigged. and none other than the American Congress, the US Congress has passed a resolution on that. So they're going to promote democracy, fight terrorism, help cooperate with Pakistan in fighting terrorism, as though terrorism is only what happens inside Pakistan, and what Pakistan does in Kashmir, which we have seen a spike in terrorism, is not terrorism. So this is the kind of, and of course the Americans were going to promote human rights in Pakistan, and this $100 million is supposed to give the Americans leverage over Pakistan's close relationship with China. And clearly, unless the Americans are doing some kind of substance abuse in State Department, everybody knows that, this is a kind of a pipe dream that the Americans are selling. But from an Indian point of view, I think it gives a very clear indication that the Americans are once again trying to flirt with Pakistan and displaying what I would call an abused wife syndrome, that maybe they can reform Pakistan, maybe they can save Pakistan from itself, and maybe they can save Pakistan from the Chinese embrace. I think all of this is a bit of a pipe dream, but this is also fueling suspicion in India. Of course, from an American point of view, they can say that, well, the Indians are hedging their bets. They don't like India keeping up its relationship with Russia, even though that relationship has kind of pared down significantly from what it once was. We are not in the 1970s. Again, that's a kind of a slogan Indians very often use of how the Russians came to Indian assistance in 1971 war. Yes, they did, but we're talking about 50 years later, 60 years later, and the same equations don't entirely hold true anymore. Yes, Russia is a valued partner, it's a friend, but there are limits to all friendships, and there is a limit to a friendship with the Russians as well, and which is very clear from if you look at the outcomes of Prime Minister Modi's visit to Moscow. It's very clear that while the Indian-Russian relationship is good, but there is no new ground which is being broken in this particular relationship. But the Americans seem to not like it, partly because the Americans are used to a world in which their friends, allies, partners will toe the American line unquestioningly. And frankly, India is not going to be ready to do that. So there is that. Certainly that factor has come in. Then on the Indian side, we see something else happen in the recent weeks, especially after the elections, and including in the budget and the economic survey. Suddenly the government in India is opening up to Chinese investments. It sees merit in Chinese investments, not in critical sectors, but in other sectors. We are seeing that there is going to be a kind of easing of the restrictions on issuing visas to the Chinese. Even when we look at the defense budget, if indeed we are perceiving such a major threat from the Chinese, if you look at the data in the defense budget, the revised budget of the last year is more than the current year's budget allocations for defense services. Although we have increased the allocation for infrastructure development along the Chinese border, and that's to be welcomed, but the fact that in terms of the kind of preparedness we need to be able to confront the Chinese, because again, let's make no mistake about it, if we get into a scrap with the Chinese, neither the Russians nor the Americans are going to be coming to our help. They're not going to be fighting on our side. We have to fight these wars alone. Yeah, maybe we will get some assistance from maybe some of our partners and friends, but to expect that anybody else is going to come and fight the wars for us, I don't think that's going to happen. So clearly India seems to be following a policy of engagement with China, and at the same time not really letting down its guard. There seems to be a degree of diffidence as well as far as India is concerned when it comes to China. Beyond a point, we are not ready to go. Of course, people will point out that, the Prime Minister congratulated the Taiwanese president on the election. There have been greetings between Taiwan and India. India has also been hosting the Tibetans out here. We have made some statements on Tibet as well. So all of that is happening on the side, but in terms of taking very solid measures against China, I don't think that's happening, or using any kind of issuing any kind of strong statements against China. That's not happening. So clearly, I think even out there, we are trying to, in a sense, ensure that things don't go out of hand, and partly that is the reason is that we don't really have too much faith in how much the Quad countries will actually stand together when it comes to a kind of a bust up with the Chinese. So I think we'll have to wait and see that when the Quad meeting takes place between the foreign ministers, whether it leads to a summit meeting later in the year, whether some new ground is broken. Yes, there could be some announcements on a range of other issues which are of a non-strategic nature. Okay, maybe not a non-strategic nature, but at least of a more benign nature, not in your face as far as China is concerned. Maybe there could be some other areas of cooperation that are identified. But will the Quad countries move to a more security-oriented approach? I don't think that seems to be on the anvil right now. But we'll have to wait and see what comes out of the foreign ministers meeting, and later, if there is going to be a summit meeting, whether there is some kind of a forward movement of a strategic nature, or it's more of the same.